is it you think that Charlotte Jay became a forgotten writer?
Wow, that's a really difficult question. I think her fame was probably more so in the US to begin with, so she was always under the radar in Australia in that sense. She didn't write much about Australia, so she had, I think, just one crime book, which was The Night is Feminine, set in Australia. A couple of her non-crime, her Geraldine Hall's titles were set in Australia, but that obviously different pen names, so there's that. Again, an easier way to forget her because they're virtually two separate people in the public eye. And I guess she was writing in a particular way that really sat in that 1950s period. That's where her crimes, and I think we've got a pulpy cover somewhere around me here that really highlights that sort of the whole 1950s crime sensibility. So tastes moved on, but I think she started off from already being under the radar in Australia.
Mm. Beating Up the Bones is the book that won her the Edgar Award for the best crime book of the year in 1952. It's not set in Australia, but it's lots of Australian connotations. Would you like to just talk a little bit about that?
Well, set in Papua, and we have our Australian female protagonist who goes up to find out what happened to her fiancé, who has supposedly committed suicide. She doesn't believe it, but she's very much the fish out of water when she gets there, and she finds this bedraggled cast of Australian expatriates when she gets there, and everyone seems to have their own agenda, and no one seems to be coping very well with being in the tropics and being in this tropical setting. And it's a really interesting insight because there's quite a lot of racism in this book, but our heroine is oblivious to it all. She's never been exposed to people of colour before, so she doesn't know that she should be treating them any differently, and she doesn't really notice racism so much when it happens around her because she's not expecting it to be there. And it's a really interesting play on race relations, and it's a really interesting play on the whole colonial thing, I think, too. It's the last days of Australia being up there and being in this sort of paternal role, and they're very aware of it too. The Australians are all aware that they're a dying breed up there, and I think they're clinging on to everything and getting quite desperate about it too.
Yes, well, when I read the book, I must say it occurred to me that just in the same way that Australia in the 19th century was seen to be the place where the ne'er-do-well sons of the wealthy from England might be sent, so I wondered if perhaps PNG was the place where the ne'er-do-well, not quite making it Australians, ended up being sent to get them out of Australia.
It certainly seems to be the way, and there's nepotism going on up there. You know, we've got brothers giving jobs to brothers, and we've even got the idea that she doesn't seem to know what her husband was doing there, and she doesn't seem to know much about him, so perhaps he was best sort of sent away to do whatever job he was doing up there. And there does seem to be that, again, this is something we see quite a bit in Charlotte Jay, this multiple layers of bureaucracy where no one actually seems to be doing anything much at all, but there's another department for that, or there's 15 people to be typing up a letter today. If only the letter could be dictated in a succinct fashion, and it's a really lovely little trope that seems to run through a lot of her work.
Yes, one thing in common with in all of her books is that she makes the most of the different places that she's experienced in her real life. She travelled with her husband to all sorts of exotic places, and many of them turn up in her books. She seemed to have a tremendous eye for place. Would you like to comment on that in terms of particularly Beating Up the Bones?
Well, I think she certainly, she dealt in Oriental art, so I think she did have that particular eye for detail. But Beating Up the Bones, I think, is particularly significant because it's that tropical sensibility, and I don't like to say that the landscape becomes the character because it's a little bit of a thing, but there's that sense of heat and torpor and oppression and things not getting done. So you can see her own relationship with the landscape there, and you can see as the story progresses, people move away from the township into sort of the less civilised country, and the jungle becomes more oppressive and the heat becomes more oppressive. And you can see how she's really used that to great effect, not so much as in describing it in great detail, but just in the way it's affecting people and in their responses to the environment that they're in.
Some people have compared it in part to Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Did that occur to you when you read it?
Not really, I don't think. I didn't sort of come at it from that perspective, but I certainly, having won that first Edgar Allan Poe Award, I can see the echoes of Poe in there, in that really claustrophobic atmosphere that's impacting on everybody, not just the central characters, but absolutely everybody.
Yes, I think the thing that lacks from the Heart of Darkness, I think, is Kurtz at the other end of the river.
Very true, yeah.
They go up the river to almost nothing.
Yes.
In the end.
Yeah.
It's said by people who were there that she's drawn a very good picture of what Port Moresby was like in those days. I also thought that in her first book, The Life is Feminine, she draws, to me, a very compelling picture of what 1950s Sydney was like. I wonder what you felt about that.
I agree. I think Sydney comes through very clearly. Little details. There's, she doesn't throw it at you, but there's just all sorts of little things, like it'll be a sprinkler in a garden, or the way the weather comes in at Bondi, or just what people are doing in the street, that just give you a sense of place, and a sense of, I think, sort of the mindset of the public at that time in that sort of post-war period. And you see that in, I think, Last Summer of the Men's Shortage, which is another sort of Sydney, that's during the end of World War II, and you get that feeling of Sydney very clearly there too. So I think it's something that she does quite well in most of her books, actually.
The other interesting thing is that the protagonist goes into the boarding house, and he finds it creepy, he finds it threatening, but he still goes in there, he still stays there. He doesn't go anywhere else.
Yes, there's this sort of, he's just drawn. He can see that it's the bad thing to do. It's that door at the end of the long hallway in every B-grade horror movie you've ever seen, that the whole audience will be sitting there screaming, "Don't open the door! Don't open the door!" But he's just, he's going to do it, and he keeps going, and he knows that there's going to be something bad there too. But it's almost a bit like a Stockholm syndrome. He's in this situation, and he knows the only thing to do is to keep following it through to the bitter end, regardless of the consequences.
One of the other books, which I think you've read, is the one set in Lebanon, where there's, again, a female protagonist who walks out on her French boyfriend lover and ends up in the clutches of a rather mysterious Syrian colonel. There's elements in that, I think, of what happens with the heroine in Beat Not the Bones. Do you think there are parallels in those two stories?
I think there are. It's an interesting take on that sort of female perspective, because her heroines in those situations are almost at once, they're helpless, they're very soft women, but again they're driven to get to the heart of what they're there for. And it's a really interesting sort of counterplay in the way her women come across, that they want to do it, but they're almost afraid to do it. So it's something, again, that she does really, really well.
And you touched on it earlier, but I wonder why it took so long for an Australian publisher to publish any Charlotte J. Wakefield Press, as you know, in Adelaide, eventually started publishing the books in the 1990s, shortly after she died.
Well, I think first of all, there wasn't a lot of homegrown Australian crime, that we weren't publishing a lot. Again, we were taking the cue from the UK, and probably to a greater extent America. America was the home of the crime novel, certainly through the 40s and 50s. And then it's, why go back if there's new talent coming onto the ground? So I think there's always that element of things that are happening in the modern world, and her books are very often of that period. You can really read the period in it, and I think certainly coming through the 60s and 70s was like, we've got to be modern, we've got to do this, we don't want to be looking back. And I think perhaps for something like Beat Not the Bones, there's a discomfort in looking back at the way Australians were and the way Australians were treating other people at that time.